And good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, according to where you are right now and listening and watching to us live on the show. This is another episode of Talk to Your Meeting Doctors. It's really, really great to be here again with all of you and with my dear co-host, Martin Duffy.
Morning, good evening, depending on where we're watching.
Absolutely. And it's a great pleasure to have as our guest speaker today, Charles Vogel from California. Hey, Charles, good to have you here.
Hello, thank you for having me.
You're very welcome, Charles. Good to meet you.
And we would just, Charles, if you could perhaps start the program by sharing something that you normally don't usually share with our viewers about yourself.
Something that I don't usually share. Well, I have a 5-year-old, and this is the first season that he's been able to get on skis and control them with big enough muscles. And so it's been a delight for the season with record snows here in California to get in the mountains with him. And one of the reasons I invest the driving time and the investment in his lessons is so we can have parent time. And it turns out it's all come to fruition. He loves it. We spend that time together. And it's very exciting in my life where I can be outdoors with him and do something active, where he has the strength and skill to do it that was never true before.
Super, yeah. Well, you've certainly gotten the snowfalls this year, Charles, in California.
I think we're at 2.5 years worth of average snowfall here in California, which is great if you're a skier, not great if you have to shovel it or it's going to melt on your house.
Okay, amazing, Charles. Thanks so much for that intro. And how do you connect that with your work as a trust expert in the field of organizational development?
So to be clear, I don't call myself a trust expert. I think you're right that in the work that I do, trust is a big part of it. My work has to do with training people in leadership roles, both formal and informal, how to connect people to them around shared purpose and values. And typically the organizations that turn to me are working in very high stakes outcomes, usually when lives are at stake, in contexts that are dynamic, which is to say they can't depend on some playbook written in 2019 to get the outcomes they're looking for. And obviously when you're working on high stakes outcomes and changing environments, trust is critical. And so my work has to do with, well, what are the contexts we create? What are things that we can do to help people connect who are important to us, socially, politically, environmentally, professionally? And as we know we need to do when we want people to connect is physically give them time to create those relationships. And we have to do that in a very specific context where there are at least 3 conditions met. One is they're physically close enough. 2, they have the time, the freedom to have the conversation they want to have. And lastly, we do that in a non-coercive environment, or said differently, the freedom to say no. And with my son, when we spend our time together going to the mountain and doing mountain sports, all those criteria are met. And I'm creating that time for us to build a relationship that has trust, that has perceived mutual understanding and care, so that when the bad days come, he knows bad days come, there's a relationship there that we can turn to and lean on to get through the bad days.
Amazing.
And the work, Charles, that you typically do, is it individually based in a kind of a coaching, mentoring type role, or is it team based, or is it a little bit of both?
Yes. So right now, organizations are bringing me in to train leaders. So I spend time with leaders, sometimes with a great deal of responsibility, to help them understand and see what's missing and what can be put in place to connect the people that they need to be connected, or again, these high stakes outcomes. And the fields that have really embraced my work in the last few years are healthcare, where in the United States, certainly, there aren't enough resources to do the job at hand. And the people who are doing the jobs, because they're so committed and they've been working so hard, are often burned out, and they need to support each other as much as physically possible. Education, where we again have people who are really committed in a changing environment that's radically different from 2019, and they need to support each other in ways, and also work with parents in ways that parents need support. And then in some cases, the military, where we have people in very dangerous situations who need to support each other. And then also cutting edge companies that are building tools that are used around the world that keep people safe or help people respond to emergencies. They need to understand how they make their teams more effective in adjusting for the future. Those are the fields. So I'll come in and my work, I think of my work, I don't know if it's true. I think of my work as introducing nothing new in concept. That the ideas, what I call the principles that connect us in ways that make us feel supported, seen, understood, and safe so that we can take on challenges in dynamic environments are very, very old. My work is about translating and distilling those so contemporary leadership can relearn them and use them. So I'll give you an example. You know, one of in the culture I live in the United States is we live in a time where people like to skip the invitations. People want to bring people together. They want to brag about how many people come together, but they make announcements. And in my work, an invitation is when we request someone to spend time with us, and they know that somebody cares if they show up. And if nobody knows if someone cares if they show up, I call that an announcement. Well, I've noticed that there are a lot of people in leadership roles, even in families, that want people to come together, and they like to skip the invitations. And they just send out mass emails. And then they're shocked and they complain that people don't show up. Well, there's an example how when we can distinguish what's missing, no one's getting invited. No one knows if they schedule at time, make the drive, find babysitting, get parking, whether you care if they show up. Let's not be surprised that people aren't coming together. So when we can give people a new vision to understand what's missing, and they can put those in place, then we get, quite frankly, radical results.
And is that something that I'm kind of curious with that idea of identifying the gap is the picture that you painted in my mind.
Yeah.
Is that very prevalent? Is that something that is that the one of the major prompts that causes you to be brought in to working on building trust or helping people to build trust?
Well, what I've noticed is when people call me, there's a context that people in leadership recognize there is a lot of loneliness and isolation. And this is unfortunately not only prevalent in the United States, but perhaps it's almost certainly at a record level. And just to give you some scale on that, Bob Putnam out of Harvard in the 1990s wrote a book called Bowling Alone, which he wrote as a warning message to America that our social fabric was eroding, that people were literally bowling alone. And things have gotten much, much worse since then. And he, in the last year, wrote a follow-up saying that was a warning and things are worse. Our current Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, wrote an entire book about the dangers and harm of the loneliness epidemic on America. And he's the Surgeon General. And just to give you a sense, it's not just the medical community, that his article on that was a front page article of Harvard Business Review. So even the most well-known business publication understands this is a front page issue for business leaders in America. So there are leaders who are paying attention to understand for their organizations to hand stakes outcomes. The loneliness and isolation is holding them back. And in many cases, it's actually deadly at a number of levels. And so that's when they reach out to me. And I know that people don't want more information. What we can do is we can shift how leaders see what's going on to see the opportunity, which quite frankly is usually pretty accessible, right? I mentioned briefly that when we create events that bring people together, we need to have 3 criteria, right? Freedom to say no, the freedom to have the conversation they want to have, and then an opportunity to grow. And that is not a high bar, but I've noticed that people who don't understand that spend a lot of money creating events that nobody wants to stay at. And quite frankly, you two are part of that group. You've been to lots of events you didn't want to stay at. I'll give you an example. My wife works for a multi-billion-dollar tech company, and this is before the pandemic. She invited me to the Christmas party of her company. And this was the only 3 hours in the year that I would meet the people that my wife was spending much of her waking hours with, right? They don't call me, we don't hang out, but I was going to get to meet them. And when I got to that party, exactly the kind of party that you expect to be planned by a 25-year-old with an American Express black card. There were 3 open bars. There was all you can eat, I'm not making this up, French fries and hamburgers. And the music was so loud that I literally couldn't speak to anybody. And so there were literally hundreds of employees and their spouses. In the only 3 hours we could connect, and we were invited to do so. And all we could do was stand in a room so loud we couldn't talk to each other around people who were encouraged to get drunk around 3 bars and eat hamburgers and French fries we could buy for ourselves the other 364 days a year. Right. And I know, because it was held in San Francisco and downtown, that they spent 5 digits on a party that didn't accomplish bringing anybody together because there were no conditions that we could do that. Now, that's an egregious case, and that I'm bringing it up because you're laughing out loud because it was so ridiculous. But that experience of being in a place where I'm invited to, and people spend lots of money to create an event where we can't actually connect after finding parking, happens every day. And once we can inoculate leaders to understand how their efforts are not working, everything changes. And quite frankly, it's not very hard. And if you're already spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on that, it's not expensive.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's kind of that's intriguing. It's you made a point earlier there that really stuck with me. The idea of isolation of the leader, the sense that leaders are isolated, and are they isolated from the rest of their organization or the people in their organization? Are they isolated from the environment in which their organizations operate? Or again, is it a little bit of all of the above? And if it is, what's driving that? Where's that coming from?
Oh my goodness, we've touched on a bunch of deep things, Martin, perhaps unwittingly. So when we talk about isolation, the work that I'm doing, it's an emotional state because people are not physically isolated. And most people I talk to who feel lonely, which is a large part of the United States, they actually have a phone with lots of people in it and they speak English. That's not the problem. It's about not feeling connected, not feeling safe to have the conversations they want to have. And for the purposes of my work, there's a lot of research on feeling connected and belonging and trust, but it overwhelms quickly. So for my work, what I say is when we want to feel connected when they believe, and for this conversation, let's say accurately, when they accurately believe that others understand them intellectually, understand them emotionally, and accept them for who they are. And the reason I say they believe it is because, Martin, you and I might meet, and that might all be true in our mission, but unless you have data that shows you that is so, you're not going to feel like you belong around me, right? I need to give you a context where that happens. And if that context is a noisy bar with free hamburgers where we can't talk, you're not going to leave that noisy bar with that data. Okay. So that's what I'm talking about. And typically when we look at large organizations, the farther up we go in leadership, the more that perception of isolation is. Yeah. And with some irony at every level thinks, well, gee, if this is going to get better, the next level up has authority to do it. And as we go up, we find ever-growing sense of ineffectiveness in making a difference. And as you go up in an organization, the number of people that we perceive understand what we're dealing with, understand the emotional toll of dealing with that, and that we believe accept us for who we are and what we're doing goes down, right? So the isolation goes up. And if there was this feeling of connection and trust, then the conversations could happen to handle things that don't get happen. And then why is it happening? So there are many hypotheses. There's research about why there's this trend of isolation. I know the United States. So in the United States, I like 3 because everybody can recognize them right away. The first one is Americans are physically moving their homes more than ever before. And every time we do that, we leave whatever group of friends and support networks we have in that location as we move to another one. So that's the first. The second one is Americans are largely leaving their home faith traditions. I'll give you a sense of that. The baby boomers, 3/4 of baby boomers identified as mainline Protestant Christians. That is no longer the case. And when we're part of a faith tradition, whatever else is true, we're often going to a place where we're with people that we perceive share our values and purpose, and then enact rituals that connect us. Now, there are many good reasons why Americans are leaving their home faith traditions. So I'm not arguing with that, but we can notice that's the context we're dealing with. Yeah. And we know that Americans haven't really changed their ideas about God, for example, but they're no longer having that community in their lives that support them. And then lastly, which is I think the elephant, is the role of social media on our social networks. We know that social networks have gone down dramatically in one generation.
Yep.
And we know that there's a correlation between time on social media and the quality of our lives going down. And when we look at cumulatively, that time 15 years old and 35 years old spent on social media, and at some level above zero, that's time not spent building the interpersonal relationships that are there for us when we need them. And we paint that brush then across the entire population, we're going to see dramatic changes in how connected people are. Social media is fantastic about connecting us with people who don't care about us. They're called followers, right? And it's terrible about connecting us with the people who really care about us and show up when we have bad days.
Absolutely.
And that sense of isolation, in terms of trust and the significance of trust for the teams and organizations in which the teams operate, is the isolation the seed of a lack of trust, or is it a kind of a symptom of a lack of trust? So does the isolation come about because we become less and less trustful, or are we becoming less and less trustful because we're becoming more and more isolated? Is there
I think they're connected, Martin. I think it's a great question. I don't think in any given culture there's one answer to that. But here's what's so, Martin. If you and I don't physically spend enough time together to create a relationship where I believe you understand me and you believe I understand you, and you get data that I accept you for who you are, if we just never have that time, that trust isn't going to be there.
Yeah.
And we know that it takes dozens of hours for someone to build a friend. Now, the reason I'm not giving you a hard number is because I'm sure there's a bell curve there. And it may have to do with how similar we think we are to one another. But the point is, it's dozens of hours. It's not dozens of minutes.
Absolutely.
And we know that it takes a multiple of that time if we spend that time over digital mediated communication, i.e. a video call, as opposed to sitting together sharing a meal.
Yeah.
I believe the ratio is 5-1. The researcher who has written about this is Marissa King, who was out of Yale, and she's now at the Wharton School. But here's the irony, Martin. If I ask you to come to my home and share dinner with me on Friday night from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock, you may look forward to that. We may have a fantastic evening, right? If I asked you to join a video call with me from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock on a Friday night, you'll probably laugh out loud. So here's the irony. We need more time to create the same relationship on video, and you want to spend less time with me on video. So if we map that out now over a team over a year, where is that going to leave us in how much trust and understanding is going to be there a year from now? Yeah. And what I find is managers I talk to, of course, want the free silver bullet. They want to schedule 1 hour, air quote, cocktail hours on video. And I've just explained to you that's never going to work. And then it gets worse than that. If we were at an event together, let's say I make hot dogs in my backyard, what's really going to happen there, Martin, you come to my backyard, is you're going to find 2, maybe 3 people that you're going to chat with from 20 minutes to 60 minutes at a time and have an intimate conversation. What I find organizations do is they put 15 people on a video call and ask people to stare at their screens for an hour. Guess what? Nobody likes doing it. Why? Because you would never do that in my backyard, right? That'd be ridiculous. So there's a principle I call the campfire experience, which they're breaking when they put 2 people on a call. But the point is, they're making efforts digitally to connect in ways that are never going to work. And I've talked to very, very famous large organizations that you think would know better, and they're spending I don't know how many millions of dollars of people time asking people or mandating people to spend time to connect in ways that will never work. And what it really does is it toxifies relationship, because you don't want to spend 3 hours in a room of 15 people on a video call with me on Friday night.
That's kind of interesting because when you tie that trajectory to the bottom line. It seems to me, at least from my experience, that the drive to create online interaction, apart from the pandemic, was its own little aberration or big aberration. But in general, the shift away from person to person time, seems to me, is driven by cost. It's driven by monetary considerations, measured through people's time. But so I suppose that leads me to think about, so where do we project the progressive breakdown in trust, if that's progressively induced by, I suppose, this sense of isolation? At what point does it affect the bottom line to such an extent that it now becomes essential to invest in people's time to recreate those connections in order to build trust, in order to make the monetary machine viable again? Is there an existential crisis that organizations, teams and organizations, are progressively heading towards, from a resource point of view? Is that where this is taken?
So the question, Martin, is when do leaders understand that the costs are so great that they need to invest in knitting together their teams in ways that they're not? Is that right?
Well, it was that they are willing to invest in online time,
right? Which
is 1/5 less productive than face-to-face time. But the reason we're going online in the first place is monetary. It's about the cost of bringing people together face-to-face in a work context or a social context is too high. But I'm then saying, okay, there's a dichotomy in my head now of the monetary costs versus the monetary benefits. And I'm just wondering, when does the penny drop? Pardon that pun. So when does the penny drop with the leader that actually you're at the back end of the drag curve, as we used to say in aviation? You're actually you're gone past diminishing returns.
So Martin, you're in aviation?
What used to be, yeah.
Okay, well, you understand aviation. So it's curious you say that, because you remember earlier in this call, I said the organizations that reach out to me, I've noticed, are in high stakes outcomes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you said, when does the penny drop? Well, those organizations understand that people die when they get it wrong. Right? They don't get to apologize, the package got lost. They don't get to reschedule an appointment. People are dead.
Yeah.
The penny drops for them and they call me. And then when we have the conversations, usually well within 2 hours, recognize what's absolutely missing, that none of their efforts are going to work. For example, if you don't have campfire experiences, intimate experiences where people can achieve the kind of relationship we've briefly referenced here, nothing's going to work. It's just never going to work. And I can't say when other leaders cry uncle, so to speak, when they recognize that the stakes are high enough. I know that there are a number of military leaders using my work. And I know that the reason they do that is they're crystal clear what the cost is if they don't get this right. And some of those people go into very, very dangerous situations. And they understand how important it is that the people who are working together and backing each other up understand each other and back each other up. Right? And that's why they use my work. I wish I could grab every leader and say, don't you see where this is going? Right? But I got to let them get there when they're ready.
Yeah,
I know that you guys know my background, who works with me. It's not an accident that amongst the most admired brands in the world work with me. And the reason I'm bringing that up here is I realize, they're the people who are on the cutting edge, who see the world is changing and see they have to respond, and they're the ones who call. Right.
Yeah, I'm ex as well, so I came through military and the aviation training, and I suppose from personal experience, where I found trust built most strongly was when you shared adversity, when you found yourself, whether in a training context or an operating context. And it had nothing to do with monetary. It always had to do with welfare, with your own well-being and your group's well-being. but again, I'm wondering, is it the relentless drive towards military? Is that the piece that's causing? Is that the fundamental cause of the breakdown in, or the cause of isolation, which becomes the fundamental seed of mistrust? Is that the?
It's a contributing context. So,
Okay.
there's a much bigger topic here I'm trying to avoid so we don't go down a deep rabbit hole, and that is what's the role of extraction?
Okay.
So when you're in the military and you're in aviation, you're crystal clear how many mistakes you get to make before people die,
Not many.
right? Especially on a landing, right?
Yeah.
And in a really admirable 20th century aviation learned a lot of hard lessons. That's how we have the checklist.
Absolutely. Yeah.
On how much you need to trust that your crew knows what they're doing and they do it in the right order. And aviation made profound changes since 1940 to make sure those mistakes don't happen. And a big part of it is how much do you trust your pilots? Do they trust each other? And how do they communicate when something needs to be handled? Well, you and I know, Martin, that took decades to work out, and pilots then have to go do it. A 35-year-old manager didn't just invent that on a Thursday to see if it would get better. Said differently, they have practices that have been used for a long time over many cultures to get it right, to make sure people don't die. Full stop. Right. So, I don't know what more to say about this, right? And the military is a great example. Oh, there's no extraction going on. When you build a relationship with a co-pilot where hundreds of people's lives are at stake, and depending on what you hit in the ground, thousands of people's lives are at stake, you spend the time to make sure you understand each other intellectually and emotionally, and that they recognize that you both recognize that you accept each other for to be a level of credential, right? And I know that pilots train a great deal to recognize that in panic situations, you need to recognize what your body does differently in a panic situation, and you need to handle it, and you need to communicate differently when there's panic going on than when there isn't, famously. Am I right, Martin?
No, absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, said differently, you train to understand each other intellectually and emotionally, and the trust is there when you understand that the other person accepts you as a pilot sitting next to them, whether things are on fire or not. Now, that's the extremist situation where people can die within seconds or minutes. The principles are true everywhere. And Mercer King wrote in her book, Social Chemistry, she compiled research that shows if there is a silver bullet for a number of headache problems leaders have, it's having a friend at work.
Yeah.
Absenteeism, accidents, engagement, and it's not rocket science. If you have a friend at work and you don't know whether you're supposed to put the landing gear up before or after, then you ask somebody and they tell you, and you don't guess and see if it works, right? If you have a friend at work and you don't have clearance to take off because you're not getting a response to the radio, but you have a friend, you call the friend and say, could you go see what's going on up there? And currently, when the formal communication doesn't work, you have an informal communication network that can patch holes, right? And if you're feeling not so great, you're having a bad day, but you're going to see your friends at work, you show up anyway because you're going to be working with friends. But here's the thing, Martin. As you know, with pilots have to spend the time to build those relationships, to have them in place on the good days and then, of course, the bad moments. And what we're seeing is a lot of organizations have pushed that aside. They're getting the results, and only the ones who are on the cutting edge and, quite frankly, dominating their fields have figured out that competitive advantage.
But I suppose, thinking about the pilot environment, one of the interesting things about it, when you take particularly large organizations that will have a lot of pilots, and not just the pilots, then it becomes about the crew, so it's about the cabin crew who have an absolutely integral, and then becomes about the service engineers that are servicing the aircraft. And so there's that whole concept of crew resource management that certainly aviation, or that's the expression that aviation uses for it. One of the ironies of that is that very often you'll fly with somebody that you've never flown with before, and potentially you won't fly with them again for another 6 months or a year. Same level of trust is engendered at a professional level, even transcending personality, where you might take a dislike to somebody. They might just not get on with you, or you don't get on with them. But in the professional setting, and I'm just wondering, that boundary between personal trust building versus professional trust building, and mindful of one of the contexts, two of the contexts that you set out, the healthcare sector and the education sector, but particularly the healthcare, where again, similarly, you can have high pressure environments, medical interventions, it's team-based. You may not get on with people personally, but at a professional level, trust exists. And I'm just wondering the foundations of that trust. Again, do you have any observations on, if it's not about personal interaction, grown out of time together and so on, what is the foundation for that professional trust that might exist?
Well, so first of all, you're talking about minimum absolute functioning, right? And I don't think most organizations want minimum absolute functioning because there's no resilience there.
Yeah.
And put you and your family on a plane that you know is going to go through a hurricane.
Yeah.
At night, do you want the crew to be on friendly terms or not?
Well, that would help.
Yeah. Yeah. You're a professional pilot, and you already know. You don't even know what's going to go on with the aircraft. You already know you want that crew to be on friendly terms, which is to say, aiming for or looking how we can cross the bottom line where people can technically get a plane on a route without crashing is not aspirational. And if you're in that kind of leadership where you're looking for that, then I don't want to work with you. And I certainly don't want to be your customer.
Yeah.
Right. That's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
But when there is that professional trust, again, you believed when you flew with pilots that you maybe didn't like personally, you believed at some level you understood them intellectually, you understood them emotionally, and that you accepted that they had the competence to get hundreds of people at 500 miles an hour back on the ground without killing anybody.
Yeah.
Full stop. And if any of that was missing, you would only be in the plane. Right? So that tells me there was a minimum level of that going on. And part of it had to do with your training on what you understand pilots have to do, what they have to know, what they have to demonstrate before they sit in that seat.
Yeah.
Right? But that's a minimum level. And I don't want to work with an organization. I certainly don't need a customer organization where they're like, well, that's good enough for us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I suppose a lot of it then comes down to the level of performance depending on the level of adversity. So if everything is working fine and smooth, we'll all get away with minimum levels on a good day.
You don't even have to fly the plane anymore, right, Martin? You just have to physically sit in the seat.
Largely, yeah.
But I know that your training was at least 90% how to handle when things go poorly.
Yeah.
Maybe it was like way more than 90%. Am I right? Yeah, I don't want to work with anybody. Everything's going to go great, Charles. And we've got our team at a functioning level that as long as the sun is shining and everything works perfectly, we're good. Yeah. Certainly not when I go to a hospital.
Yeah, so that interpersonal connection is, again, you're taking me right back into what's the real core foundation. And it's that, I suppose it's a human need, isn't it? To connect, human need to be part of each other's lives and so on.
Yeah. And what we could, further go out, organizations are the ones that, for-profit organizations often contact me, but at the end of the day, Martin, you didn't go into aviation because you list and a spreadsheet, and it showed that if you spent all that time training to be in aviation, you'd make plenty of money and that'd work out great. Am I right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Said differently, is there was a set of values that brought you to aviation and to work with all those people you did. And every time you got in a plane, you had a very clear purpose. And certainly one of those is keep these people safe, whoever these people are. Full stop. Right?
That's
no question about it.
Top of the agenda.
And if somebody's sitting and somebody's in the cockpit or they're supporting the cockpit, they better share that purpose. Full stop. And if 20% of them is like, I'm not that committed to everybody on this plane walking away safely, I know exactly how quickly you're going to get rid of them on your crew. Said you had crystal clarity on shared value and purpose. Now, the thing about being on a plane is there's crystal clarity about that.
Yeah.
But on other teams, that's not always true.
Yeah.
Especially and when you're a pilot, there's not a lot of room for creativity. You don't invent a new way to circle an airport. You don't creatively come up with a way to put down a jumbo jet. You just do it the way it's supposed to happen.
Yeah.
Right. The creativity might come when things go poorly. What's that?
No, you're doing the opposite. You're actually looking to do it as close to the absolutely standardized way as you can possibly get.
So in a field where it's standard point where there's literally a manual for every contingency that someone could dream up, you recognize the importance of having everybody lined up with shared values and purpose and clarity about that. Am I right?
Yeah, no, that's correct. Yeah.
Martin, then how the hell important it is when they're now in an environment where creativity is required? Because guess what? This year doesn't look like 2019.
And difference is absolutely part and parcel of it every day. Right. Yeah.
So I love this conversation because I'm talking to a man who professionally understands the importance of having that connection when it's predictable. And the world gets really more complicated. So if you're working in a tech firm, and products being released in 2 years, and 2023 doesn't look like anything like 2019, and which tells you how much you know about 2025.
Yeah.
How much do you want that team to be connected and creative and adaptive when there is no manual?
Yeah.
And when you're running an emergency department in America, when you've lost tens of thousands of nurses and doctors in your field, and there's medicine shortages, and there are new political restrictions on what you can and cannot do, and you don't even understand the insurance system that funds it, how much more important is that you have a team that understands and respects each other?
Yeah. I'm just mindful of time, Charles, but could I just to one thing that you spoke about much earlier on? We talked about, I asked you about why, why would there be a breakdown in people's sense of isolation or sense of connectedness, actually?
Yeah.
And one of them was social media. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the impact of social media from your experience and the contribution that has made to an increasing sense of isolation? Yeah.
So here's a funny answer for you, Martin. I am actually off of social media. And the reason is the research, as I've read it, is crystal clear. More social media makes your life worse. It shows that there's a certain level, a sweet spot of very little social media that helps just because you're connected at some level. You're not totally disconnected.
Yeah.
So, for example, I go to LinkedIn. I don't post very much, but I'm on there to see what friends and colleagues are doing. But there's no Twitter feed that I'm feeding. There's no TikTok. I'm off of Facebook. And guess what, Martin? My life is fantastic. And you guys found me anyway.
Yeah.
Even though I'm not tweeting.
Yeah.
Right. So, when you say what's my experience is when I did what the research said I should do, which is get away, my life got awesome. Maybe it was great before, but it's certainly fantastic now.
Yeah.
And the research is still clear that the more we spend on that, the worse. There's just an article this week in the New York Times how when we look at how seniors use social media or digitally mediated relationships, how it is a far less enriching experience to have relationships on digital media than in person. And it's having digitally mediated relationships is better than no relationships.
Yeah.
But it's not even close to personal. Well, one generation ago, all of senior relationships were in person.
Yeah.
And we know where the trend is going. Well, that tells us then what elderly years can look like as far as being connected. Or said differently, relying on that is making less. And let us not, just like your earlier example, let us not then go find the worst case scenario and then aspire to the absolute minimum experience and say, well, is that great? Because no, it sucks. It's the absolute minimum scenario in a crisis.
Even in a non-crisis, and that's why I just wanted to get your take in a bit more depth on the social media piece, because certainly from my personal point of view, it's something I'd have very significant concerns about. That
Yeah, I'll tell you, Martin, as a thought leader, you're supposed to be optimistic. That's one of the rules of a contemporary thought leadership. And the reality is, the research is really clear. It's been getting worse. It was bad in the 90s, such that Bob Putnam wrote the book, and it's been getting worse. So the trends are going where they're going. So here's where the optimism is, Martin. In a desert, you don't need a very big water pot to bring up flowers because it's a desert. And Martin, you and I are living in a desert. We're surrounded by people who are parched for connection. So when we learn to get better at bringing people together, it's amazing what moves. It's amazing what changes around us.
And changes.
And that's my experience.
Yeah.
And that's my experience. My wife and I have committed to building relationships at our church, and the church is in East Oakland. And there are a lot of flowers in those relationships. When I go around the country and I'm training people to do this, I hear stories about people bringing the people important to them in new ways and radically changing lives in radical ways. And quite frankly, when I work with veterans, in life-saving ways.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you a quick story. I worked with an organization called Warriors Breaking Bread that was inspired by my work. And a guy named Eric Paul, fairly recent, recognized the loneliness among veterans, both his own experience and peers. And so, inspired by my work, he wanted to create a dinner series where he would bring veterans together to share a meal together, but not just any old steak dinner, because you can get anywhere, but in a ritualized way that made that a powerful experience.
Mm-hmm.
And in the first year, he hosted 10 dinners, not 10 cities, not 10 programs. He hosted 10 dinners. And he didn't overthink it. He hosted them in a steak restaurant because veterans that he knew liked steak. And I remember at the end of those 10 months, he wanted to show his funder something about how he was making a difference. And the funder was just wanted to get something. So Eric asked the participants of the program to write something about what the dinners meant to them. Just something he could show his donor to say, hey, we're doing the thing we said we'd do. And I was in the room when that donor read the pack of essays that those guys wrote. And remember, they're veterans. They're not English lit majors from fancy schools. Mm-hmm. And several of them had shared that the dinners had saved their lives. And one guy had written in his essay about how at one point he was going to the storage locker to go get the tool. Mm-hmm. And I remember that's when we all realized hosting 10 dinners in a way that was just welcoming people, honestly, and that kids kept their fathers.
Yeah.
So when I say that you don't need a very big flower pot, I mean 10 dinners save lives.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And listen, Charles and Martin, taking advantage here of your presence in this, what would be a fascinating masterclass, Charles, that we are receiving from you. And I'm sure our viewers will enjoy it thoroughly too. Let me grab your presence here. And Martin, if you don't mind,
of course.
A last question, because we are close to our final time. I realize that there's perhaps a generation gap in terms of when I attend video conferencing. I see younger people attending a conference that they don't mind being with the video off while engaging in a business meeting, right, with potential customers and stuff. So what piece of advice, Charles, would you give to people that don't mind having their video off in terms of that building for or against a trust relationship that we all need in these crazy times?
Well, I don't think the video on or the video off is the issue at hand. And I think one of the reasons we're seeing people take video off is we're tired of managing our presentation, our avatar of ourselves on video. And much of the reason those conversations we want to disengage is they're not enriching relationally. They're almost certainly purely transactional.
Correct. Correct.
So I don't have an opinion about who wants the video on or off. When we're speaking to people in leadership roles and they're concerned about how they're going to connect people, the bigger issue to pay attention to is how is time spent in ways that are non-transactional, that are giving room for that conversation that allows a mutual understanding of purpose and values and intention. And when you see those conversations coming off, that fatigue is going to erode.
Yeah, the type conversations, just in the context of your question, Paul, at conferences or meetings, the type conversations that take place during the coffee break,
right?
Not the ones that happen during the session. And the other.
No.
Sorry, Paul, go on.
No, I mean, the kind of conversations I'm talking about here have to do totally with transactional matters, right? We are discussing business, but my question is that don't you think that by showing your face, by adding this extra human layer on a otherwise transactional meeting, your life would be improving?
Not if I'm exhausted by presenting myself for a seemingly never-ending series of transactional conversations. You know, when someone's going to clean my teeth at the dental office, I'm not invested in creating a really rich emotional relationship there. And she doesn't either. She's got someone else to clean teeth after I leave. There needs to be enough respect and admiration that we can have that transactional relationship. But you know, we don't spend time together afterwards, and she's got something else to do. So I want to moderate how much the word that comes to mind is emotionally exposing that. And after all these years, no surprise, people are burned out.
Yeah, I think but there's another thing, Paul, that your question prompted me to reflect on, that when we do get people back into meetings, into conferences, into groups and workshops and so on, probably one of the hardest questions to put to people is, what are we going to do with, the mobile phone? What are we going to do with this thing? And the fact that it gets in the way of creating those personal connections that you're talking about, Charles. That, what I'm taking out of our conversation here is that the progressive erosion in our understanding of the importance of those coffee break moments when we get to chat with people about what we did last night or what we did tomorrow night or what our kids are getting up to at the weekend, where we create the shared experience, which becomes the foundation on which trust can slowly build. And it's at the intellectual level, it's at the emotional level, it's at the shared values level. But if we don't have the opportunities to make those interpersonal sharings in person, then we're at a major deficit to build the foundation of trust that the rest of the organization and the teams and endeavors and activities can build on. That's, for me, just connecting your last question, Paul, with Charles, everything that you've said over the last 40 odd minutes. It really distills, in my mind, down into the water cooler moments are probably 100 times more important than the 2 or 3 hours that we do in the business section, which is all transactional stuff, but actually may do absolutely nothing to lay a foundation on which trust can get built and can grow with.
You're absolutely right, Martin. And just to make clarity for listeners, you call them water cooler moments. In my refer to that water cooler moment as an intimate experience. And for the purpose of training, we call those campfire experiences, an idea that we're trying to create the kind of conversations that happen at a campfire.
Yeah.
But the reason I stay away from, say, calling it a water cooler experience is it doesn't need to be as superficial as what happens at a water cooler. And you don't need a water cooler.
Sure. Yeah.
But you need to have those intimate experiences. And, I can't say whether 3 hours of an agenda is more or less important than those intimate experiences. But here's what I do know, Martin. If you're putting your family on a plane that's going into a level 4 hurricane, you want to make sure that that crew has spent enough intimate conversation time, that there's enough trust there that when something goes wrong, they're already reading each other's mind.
Absolutely.
So when you say how important is it? Well, it's not important if it's always a sunny day and all the equipment works and the fuel is clean. But we change any of those variables, and all of a sudden it's, well, we know exactly where your family's going.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, amazing conversation, but we have to wrap up, right, Martin? And we could be here for hours, and
absolutely.
Listening and learning from Charles. Amazing conversation, Charles, and it was great to have you here. Martin, perhaps you'd like to summarize a little bit, and we wrap up with the last.
Yeah, just I suppose the first for me, you kind of opened, Charles, by taking us into the context and the connections that people have. You identified 3 different elements. One is the physical capacity or physical proximity. 2 is creating the time, and then 3 was creating a free environment, or an environment in which free exchange can happen unimpeded. We then talked a little bit about identifying the gaps between people, but particularly then you talked about the isolation of the leader and the sense that some leaders have this developing sense of isolation from their teams, from their groups. And when I asked about why was that isolation developing, you identified again 3 key elements, one of which was social media, but the other was the idea of people physically moving jobs, moving locations, moving home, but equally moving groups. And you spoke a little bit about faith and moving their faith groups. Now, irrespective of what religious beliefs you might have, the key point is that when people are moving from a known community, whatever the community is, now we end up with the possibilities of greater and greater isolation. But I suppose the key thing that I'm taking out of our conversation is that the interpersonal connections coming from shared experiences, from shared emotional grounding, from shared intellectual exposure, that those elements create the foundation on which trust ultimately can get built. And I suppose the final takeaway and the final analogy, which I really love, is that it doesn't take much water to get growth in a desert. And as a really simple summary of, is it a hopeful or a hopeless environment, I would share your optimism and say, actually, a teacup of water will do an awful lot to build an awful lot of growth in a desert.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Martin. And over to you, Charles. Last piece of advice for our viewers and wherever they are.
I'm happy to give advice, but I want to make sure that your listeners know that I've written several books on the subject. And so if their interest is piqued whatsoever, there is more. And they're the books that are being used around the world and some of the world's most famous brands to make their teams more effective and to connect people in ways that are supportive in a crisis time. My first book, Unity, and then I wrote a book called Storytelling for Leadership, because in all leadership, bringing people together is their powerful stories that make that happen. And then lastly, my latest book on the subject is Building Brand Communities. In this case, any organization, for-profit, nonprofit, political, that has a brand, how to bring people together that are important for success. And then last piece of advice, let's go start at the beginning. All community starts at the same place, an invitation. And my work, invitation is a request to spend time where someone knows that someone cares if they show up. And I'm convinced that if everybody listening right now invites 5 people they already want to spend more time with, just makes the request to spend that time, walking around a park, eating apples, playing with dogs, all count. That's the beginning of relationships that can grow much deeper.
Hey, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for watching us today. Charles Vogel, our guest speaker today, was an amazing masterclass. Thank you so much, Martin, as usual, for the wonderful summary of the conversation. And for our viewers who want to know more about Charles Vogel, just follow him on this event page. He's our guest speaker for today. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for watching. It was really great to be here with all of you. Bye for now.
Thanks very much. Bye all.
Recording stopped.
Okay.
And thank you so much, Charles. Whoa, I loved the conversation. I was like taking notes from you two guys talking to each other. Was masterclass.
Super, really interesting discussion, Charles. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you. You're working at Google, right, Charles?
I worked with Google. The work was embraced so much that they hired someone I recommended, a friend of mine, to lead. This is public, so I can talk about it. She was hired. It was public that I hired her.
You're no longer in Anderson.
Well, Google is very strict about what to be made public, to the point of silliness, quite frankly, where there's nothing that I know about Google that would shift the share price or embarrass them. But you know, I don't want. But they posted the job publicly, and then it's public that they hired Marjorie. And she's hiring a team. So Google is now hiring an entire team called the community team to take these ideas across the company worldwide. Marjorie's building a team for the United States, and I'm certain the way they're going to do it is they're going to create programs in the United States, and then once that has success, roll out worldwide. So I'm not actively working with Google now, and my work is being rolled out. The plan is worldwide, and I anticipate that when Marjorie has that team ready and they've got the program going, they'll bring me in to train the leadership. And then they was the first, what they called it a external thought leader for the Google School for Leadership. So I was videoed for Google, and that media is available to Google leadership. The goal of the program was to train 20,000 Googlers, but I don't know, because it's a video, I don't know how much that's being used for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
Oh, amazing. Oh, whenever we do a show on leadership, Charles, do you mind we tap you again?
Yeah. Well, this is an important conversation to have, because people are definitely. So just to give you a sense of scale, according to the United States, 80% of 18 to 24-year-olds report themselves as lonely. 80%. And the reason that's interesting is not just because it's a freaking crisis, but it used to be just casual knowledge that the loneliest generation in the era was the oldest generation, and that is no longer true. Said differently, that generation doesn't have the skills to create the relationships they need to handle the world as they're finding it, and they're not going to get them magically. So, in as much as this relates to business, that's great. And can you imagine hiring 8 out of 10 people who don't have the skills to build interpersonal relationships and expect them to lead in the organization? Then all of a sudden, how important is my work?
Yeah.
Right? It's a shit show. It's a freaking nightmare. And it's not that everybody else is doing great and that generation is failing, but 80%. So I took my son to Hamburgers yesterday, and when I see young people gathered, I keep that statistic in mind. It's a nightmare. So yes, bring me back. We can go deeply, and we cannot talk about this enough. And there's a reason our Surgeon General wrote a whole damn book on it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Charles. Thank you so much, Martin.
Yeah. Okay.
And enjoy the rest of your day, Charles, to you, and enjoy the evening, Martin.
Thanks for reaching out,
Charles,
guys. You know where I am.
Pleasure talking to you. Thanks a million for your time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Talk soon.